Let's kick off another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm your host for another jam-packed trip to vintage paperback paradise. Be sure to check out paperbackwarrior.com for loads of reviews and episodes of this very show. Follow us on Facebook and X and YouTube for all of the up-to-the-minute happenings right here at the blog. If you want to donate, feel free to do so on the desktop version of the podcast on the right-hand column. Your money allows me to pay for things like my Dropbox storage, to house all these episodes and reviews, the domain cost, my podcast server cost, and my editing software through Adobe. Which makes me think, remember when you could just buy a computer program and that one cost was it? Now it's like this monthly bill for all these subscriptions and streaming and hosting. It's all really confusing and terribly expensive. But your donations help pay those costs and my time putting on this magic show before the people. Today's episode features a look at Alistair MacLean. Many of you have asked for a feature on this author through the years, and today is the day. I'll look at his writing career and the numerous books he wrote, the screenplays he created, and his personal life, which includes multiple retirements, divorces, court cases, and so forth. Also today I'll review another Griff Hosker novel. The last episode I presented a review of his East Indiaman novel. I wanted to try another of his books, and I picked Viking Slave. So I'm excited to talk about all of these topics. But first, just a few days prior to this show's recording, I learned that author Robert Randisi passed away. Randisi authored over 600 novels and countless short stories. His contribution to the Western, mystery, action, adventure, and crime fiction is unparalleled. Booklist magazine said he may be the last of the pulp writers. Randisi's literary work was often praised by his contemporaries. According to an interview in spywrite.com, Randisi was 15 years old when he made the decision he wanted to be a full-time writer. He was influenced by the greats like Ian Fleming, Donald Hamilton, Richard Prather, and Ross MacDonald. After he sold his first literary works to Charter, he decided to audition with a publisher to write Nick Carter Killmaster novels. The audition was a success, and Randisi wrote 6 installments between 1981 and 1983. Which was a proving ground for him to learn the publishing industry basics. Now, Randisi wrote shorts for mystery magazines like Mike Shane, Alfred Hitchcock, Ellery Queen, and magazines such as The Armchair Detective, Hardboiled, and Detective Story magazine. His shorts and novellas have appeared in countless anthologies, some that he even edited himself. Some of his Western titles included books like Tracker, Angel Eyes, Rider, Decker the Bounty Hunter, Mountain Jack Pike, Shelter, Sons of Daniel Shea, and Widowmaker. He also authored westerns as Ralph Compton, and he also wrote installments in the Trailsman series, and he helped create the popular character the Gunsmith. And believe it or not, he wrote a book per month in the series for 27 years. He also authored tons of mystery and crime fiction titles, including Miles Jacoby, Mick Delvecchio, The Rat Pack Mystery, Hitman with a Soul, Nashville PI, and a dozen or more standalone thrillers. Someday, Robert Randisi is due a full-blown feature on this very show, but for now, I'll extend my condolences to his family, friends, colleagues, and fans, which I'm one of them. Now, on my desk here, I have some new books from Starkhouse Press that will be published next month. The first is Black Gat book number 65, titled Too Rich to Die by H. Verner Dixon. It's about a rich guy who ends up in a drunk driving accident that ends in murder. He escapes the wreckage, runs away, and establishes a new identity as a Cannery Row fisherman. He then becomes involved with 2 women, one who socializes with the low class, and another that is climbing the social ladder. He creates alliances, makes enemies, and reverts back to his old habits. It seems like this guy's a real heel. Again, the book is called Too Rich to Die by H. Verner Dixon. Another from Starkhouse Press is The Hanging Man, which is a short story collection of Bill Pronzini's Western stories. These stories were originally published from 1972 through 2007, and there's 18 stories in the book. The last book I have here is a twofer by Sax Rohmer. The titles are She Who Sleeps and Moon of Madness. Now, both of these were originally published in the 1920s, and the book includes an intro by Curtis Evans, and it has really nice artwork as well. It's a nice packaging to this book. Okay, I'm ready for a feature. How about you? I'll get in my favorite chair, you get in yours. Or if you're driving, just stay in the one you're in, please. You can only leave a moving vehicle during the rapture. I'm going to hit the feature tune and then I'll be right back. Alistair MacLean was a Scottish author that many consider a cornerstone of the contemporary action-adventure thriller market. His contemporaries were Desmond Bagley and Jack Higgins in terms of household names associated with the genre. Most of his novels were adapted into films, with the 1960s being the most well-respected era for both his novels and his movies. He lived from 1922 until 1987 and produced 32 books, including nonfiction, fiction, and one short story collection. So let's take it from the beginning. MacLean was born in Shettleston in Glasgow, Scotland on April 21, 1922. His father was a Church of Scotland minister and taught MacLean only the Scottish Gaelic language until MacLean attended school. When MacLean was just 13 years of age, his father died. Now, when MacLean was 19 years of age, he joined the Royal Navy during World War II. His time in the war was very, very intense. He served in the Atlantic Theater, the Pacific Theater, and the Mediterranean Theater, performing Arctic convoys, aircraft carrier escorts, liberating prisoners of war, and sinking blockade runners. One of MacLean's courses was back and forth to Murmansk in the Arctic Circle, which Churchill described as, quote, the worst journey in the world, unquote. After the war, MacLean studied English at the University of Glasgow and worked as a street sweeper and labored at the post office. After graduation, MacLean began teaching school. Now, for extra money, he sold stories to the Daily Mirror and the Evening News. MacLean won a writing competition for his nautical short story, Delius, that was hosted by the newspaper Glasgow Herald. Publishing company Collins showed interest in MacLean's writing and met with him to suggest he write a novel. MacLean went to writing right away and produced his first book, HMS Elysius, which was based on his experiences in the war, along with the experiences of his brother Ian serving as a master mariner in the Royal Navy. The book sold 250,000 copies in hardback in England, its first 6 months of publication, so this thing was pretty successful. Once the film rights were sold, MacLean was able to become a full-time writer and quit his day job. MacLean's period between 1955 to 1959 was immensely successful. He authored the books The Guns of Navarone, South by Java Head, The Last Frontier, which was also titled The Secret Ways in the U.S., and a book called Night Without End. The aforementioned The Guns of Navarone was the author's second career novel and led to a successful theatrical film of the same name, starring Gregory Peck, Anthony Quinn, and David Niven. I reviewed the book on the paperbackwarrior.com blog, and in my review I declared it an absolute masterpiece of high adventure. MacLean will return to this book later in his career, which we'll discuss in a moment. From what I could gather online, MacLean's third novel, South to Java Head, was originally submitted to his publisher, Ian Chapman, who felt the book wasn't as good as the first two efforts. It was then pitched as a screenplay, which gathered 20th Century Fox to become involved. Due to the screenplay being purchased, the novel was then published and was very successful. The film never got into production and was eventually canceled. Then it was bought again in 1960, but once again no film resulted from the film option purchase. Okay, so it's 1960 and MacLean has just experienced tremendous success from his first 5 novels. The last 5 years have been a whirlwind of quitting his day job, becoming a full-time author, and dabbling in the film industry with options and screenplays and the like. The author begins to question his career at this point, which is really strange considering the fortune he's making and the books he's selling. But he begins to think that anything he writes is being purchased by readers and that his name is the reason for the readers buying his books. It's strange. Most authors would think, hey, I'm making a fortune and my name is known across households worldwide and I'm a booming, thriving moneymaker. The author's weird perception increases tenfold when The Guns of Navarone becomes a hit film in 1961, which leads to more recognition and success around the MacLean name. In a rather weird career move, MacLean wants to see if people will buy his books on the strength of the story. So he decides to create a pseudonym for himself, that of Ian Stewart. Using that name, MacLean writes The Dark Crusader. In the U.S., that book is called The Black Shrike. MacLean explained at the time that he normally wrote adventure stories and that this book was more of a private eye or secret service novel, and he didn't want to confuse his readers. So guess what? The book didn't sell. This could have been due to the author's name being unknown, or it could have just been that the book wasn't as good. Who knows? He returned to his name the following year for The Golden Rendezvous in 1962. However, he wanted to try his experiment again with the Ian Stewart pseudonym, so he wrote The Satan Bug under that name. I assume it didn't sell as well, so he dropped that whole idea after this book. His next literary work was a non-fiction effort titled All About Lawrence of Arabia. Then in 1963, he wrote Ice Station Zebra, which was adapted to film in 1968. So now MacLean reaches a crossroads. He wrote 10 novels, he's become wealthy enough to retire. So he does. MacLean retires from writing and explains to his publisher, friends, and family that he never enjoyed writing and he only did it to make money. So MacLean's retirement leads him into the hotel business. He buys the Jamaica Inn on Bodmin Moor and 2 other hotels. None of these business ventures worked out. In 1965, MacLean sees his novel The Satan Bug adapted into a successful film. This provokes him into writing again. However, the second incarnation of MacLean's writing career is slightly different. His approach to writing novels switches to that of screenplays. He now envisions the characters in action as how it would look on a theatrical screen more than what it would look like on paper. The style is a little different, with short action sequences populated by multiple characters and perspectives. His first book post-retirement is When 8 Bells Toll, which MacLean wrote both as a book and a screenplay. Now, I reviewed this book on the blog as well and described it as a sort of detective novel with adventure tendencies. I really enjoyed the book. Of course, the novel was made into a film in 1971, which I haven't seen. It starred Anthony Hopkins. Along with Ice Station Zebra and Guns of Navarone, one of MacLean's most iconic novels is Where Eagles Dare. It was published in 1967, and MacLean wrote the novel and screenplay at the same time. I reviewed it on the blog and described it as the iconic, captivating novel of high adventure. Highest recommendation possible. The film is just as good, with starring roles played by Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood. The movie is considered one of the best action movies ever, and dominantly one of the best war films ever created. In 1968, MacLean fell back on his novel The Guns of Navarone for inspiration. Now, to be clear, the novel and the film adaptation are different in a lot of ways. MacLean particularly liked the film version and decided to write a book as a sequel to the film, not necessarily a sequel to his own novel. That book is Force 10 from Navarone. Readers describe it as combining the ideas of The Guns of Navarone with Where Eagles Dare, which makes sense considering MacLean had just wrote Where Eagles Dare. The book was published in 1968, and the film followed 10 years later in 1978. However, the film doesn't really have much to do with the book. MacLean even adapted part of the film screenplay, because it was so different, into his 1982 novel Partisans. MacLean continued writing novels from 1969 through 1971. After that 3-year period, which produced 3 novels, MacLean reaches another crossroads. He takes a break from fictional writing and switches to non-fictional books about Scotland and Captain Cook. After this bit of a sabbatical, MacLean returns to fiction and writes novels every single year from 1973 through 1986, with the only year he didn't produce a novel being just 1979. All of these books were written like a screenplay, which was MacLean's formula at this point. The Way to Dusty Death was published in 1973 and was the first return to fiction for the author. The title is from a line in Macbeth, and the book was influenced by MacLean's friendship with race car driver Jackie Stewart. The book stars a Formula One driver embroiled in a tale of smuggling, illegal gambling, and so forth. The book's finale is one long car chase through the French Alps, which is really cool. Now, this book was pitched around in the 1980s for a theatrical film. Sylvester Stallone had some interest in the movie, but for whatever reason, it just never worked out. Instead, a lame 1995 made-for-TV film appeared based on the book. Depending on who you talk to, most of these late-era MacLean books were average at best. Moments of greatness, but the consistency was lacking. They have a ranking on the AlistairMacLean.com website, which I don't believe is an official website, and they have almost every one of the books from this period on the bottom of their ranking. Note that list states the top 5 MacLean books are The Secret Ways, The Satan Bug, Ice Station Zebra, HMS Ulysses, and Night Without End. Where Eagles Dare was 6th, and Guns of Navarone was 10th. MacLean's second to last book was The Lonely Sea, which features short nautical stories. That also includes the story that won him the literary award when he was in school, Delius. Obviously, we talked through a great deal of MacLean's books, but I was curious on MacLean's appearances in the men's action-adventure magazines. Who better to appear in a men's action-adventure magazine than MacLean? I reached out to Bob Dice, who runs the menspulpmags.com website and edits, writes, and co-creates the Men's Adventure Quarterly magazine, which is available on Amazon, as well as huge collections of men's action-adventure like Exotic Adventures of Robert Silverberg, Barbarians on Bikes, Cuba, Sugar, Sex, and Slaughter, and Weasels Ripped My Flesh, which, by the way, is out now in a brand new edition with better scans and added sidebars. Now, Bob Dice is the man when it comes to these magazines, and he was able to delve into his own personal archives, and he found 4 book bonuses. The February 1962 Argosy issue features Fear is the Key with artwork by Lou Feck. The December 1967 issue of Argosy features Where Eagles Dare with Herb Mott art. The August 1965 issue of Man's World featured Flight of the Spy Masters, which is a condensed version of events that happened in the book Night Without End. The art was by Tom Shoemaker. The last was the Grand Prix Heroine Connection, which was condensed events from The Way to Dusty Death. It was featured in Stag's April 1974 issue with Bruce Minnie art. Thanks to Bob Dice for providing all that information. I wanted to just close up the feature with a look at MacLean's personal life. Now, the theme through MacLean's personal life is one of sadness, low self-esteem, and self-doubt. No matter how many books he sold or how much money he made, he still felt like he wasn't a very good writer. He often told his friends and family that he wished he could have wrote at least one good book. In 1978, MacLean was quoted as saying, "It's not as if I write that well. I do feel my English isn't very good. In fact, I'd rather write in Gaelic or Spanish than English." He claimed that he wrote his books in about 35 days because he disliked writing so much, and the sooner he finished the book, the better. He supposedly never reread any of his books, and in 1970, MacLean was quoted as saying, "Give me 10 years, a few more books, and maybe I'll be half as good as Raymond Chandler." He once was quoted as saying, "I am just a journeyman. I blunder along from one book to the next, always hopeful that one day I will write something really good." Now, when he owned the Jamaica Inn Hotel during his first retirement phase, MacLean was quoted as saying he had more in contact with real life in just 1 hour of selling trinkets in the souvenir shop than 9 years of writing novels. MacLean was married twice. His first marriage was to Gisela Heinrichsen. They met while both were working in a hospital in 1949. They dated for 1 year and then married in 1953. They divorced in 1972. They had 2 sons and 1 adopted son. Supposedly, the heroine, Helene Fleming, in MacLean's novel Night Without End may have been inspired by his wife. MacLean's second marriage was to Mary Marcel Guberg, I can't pronounce the name, a French movie executive and former actress. They were married from 1972 until 1977. She claimed that MacLean was impossible to live with. MacLean's bout with alcoholism plagued his personal life often. To escape England's aggressive tax system, MacLean and his family moved to Switzerland in 1958. He also lived in other places as well, including Los Angeles. In January 1987, MacLean suffered a series of strokes and collapsed while on a visit to Munich. He later died on February 2, 1987, in Munich. He is buried in Switzerland. His obituary states, quote, "He wrote books to make air journeys tolerable and to take people out of themselves for a few hours. He did it very well. He gave countless hours of pleasure to millions of people. There are worse epitaphs." Unquote. Now, I do want to discuss a couple of series titles that were drafted by MacLean or were influenced by his writing, as well as a court case. First is the UNACO series. Now, the origin of the series is that in 1977, MacLean wrote story outlines with the intention of screenplays starring an organization titled UNACO, which stands for United Nations Anti-Crime Organization. MacLean put the ideas together and was then asked by his publisher to author the first book of the series, Hostage Tower. However, MacLean declined because he was already writing a novel at that time. The publisher then hired two authors, John Edwards and Dennis Frost, to write Hostage Tower, and it was published in 1980 under the pseudonym of John Dennis. The movie adaptation was broadcast on CBS television. A sequel was then published in 1981 by the same duo of authors titled Air Force One is Down. This was based off of a screenplay that MacLean pitched to NBC. These were the only two books of the series that were authored during MacLean's lifetime. This is important. A third book appeared in 1989 after MacLean's death titled Death Train, and it's authored by another Scottish writer named Alistair MacLean. Now, this led to some controversy and ended up in court. The reason is because HarperCollins, the publisher, placed Alistair MacLean's name in large fonts at the top of the book's cover. Then below that, the book title in much smaller print. Then at the very bottom of the cover, it had the name Alistair MacLean to really confuse consumers. The publisher did change this later in the series, but for a while the MacLean name was so large on these books that people were buying them thinking they were long-lost MacLean novels. After the third book, Death Train, MacLean would author 6 more series installments until 1995. This 1995 book, Rendezvous, was based off of MacLean's short story featured in the collection The Lonely Sea. The series switched to author Hugh Miller for the last 2 books, both published in 1997 and 1998. Now, HarperCollins needed more books that they could use with the MacLean name on it, so they coordinated with MacLean's ex-wife, Mary Gilberg, to publish 3 more novels that rode off of the author's name. Here's how it shakes out. In a divorce settlement, MacLean was ordered to provide the rights to a screenplay he wrote titled Golden Girl to his ex-wife in a settlement of property. The ex-wife was then either poached or reached out to HarperCollins with the screenplay. HarperCollins hired author Simon Gadolfi to write a novel titled Golden Girl from the screenplay, and the publisher, of course, put the Alistair MacLean name near the top of the book's cover. Then, 2 sequels to the book were published, Golden Web and Golden Vengeance. Publishers kept the MacLean legacy rolling in order to capitalize on that household name. In 1996 and 1998, 2 books were published that starred characters from Guns of Navarone and Force 10 from Navarone. Those books were titled Storm Force from Navarone and Thunderbolt from Navarone. Both were authored by Sam Llewellyn. I hope you enjoyed this feature on Alistair MacLean. My references for this feature was an excellent and massive discussion thread found on ajb007.co.uk. Also the site Undiscovered Scotland, AlistairMacLean.com, The Sunday Post, adazing.com, encyclopedia.com, and scottishplaces.info. Now, on to the next subject. Today's review, which is another historical adventure novel by self-published author Griff Hosker. I loved his 2024 book East Indiaman and was excited to read another of his books. So I picked Viking Slave. This was originally published in 2013 and is the first novel in the Dragonheart series. So far, there have been 22 books in this series. Griff Hosker is becoming quite the prolific author. Now, Viking Slave begins in 790 AD and introduces a young boy nicknamed Crow. He's shunned by his village and he's often bullied due to being the only dark-haired kid. See, he's not a true Saxon like his father. In the opening pages of the first chapter, the Vikings, which are just called men from the north, invade the village and collar men, women, and children onto boats. In the Viking village, a leader named Butar takes Crow's wife as his slave woman and agrees to make Crow a slave of his household. Slaves are called jarls in this book. Now Harold renames the boy Gareth and places a responsibility on the young man to care for his elderly father, a once proud warrior named Ragnar who lost an arm in battle. Gareth finds his new home and family a blessing compared to the harsh treatment he received from his former Saxon village. Because of his enthusiasm and work ethic, Buttar takes a liking to the kid and quickly begins to think of him as his own son. In a traditional coming-of-age tale, Ragnar begins teaching Gareth life skills and sword fighting. Gareth naturally takes to the sword and is able to prove himself at a young age by fighting off a pack of wolves. Eventually, Gareth rises in the ranks to become a Viking warrior leading his own band of warriors on slave raids. Without digging into the weeds of his 200-page book, the overall concept is Gareth proving himself in battle and separating from the original Viking village to carve his own path. His transition from young bully kid to warrior, leader, husband, and father is just a pleasure to read. There are numerous genre tropes here, like the power of the sword, rebellion, usurping leaders, revenge, loss, and so forth. But that's really the basis of the historical adventure genre as a whole. It's to be expected. How the author navigates within that genre and story is key, and I believe Hosker commands that ability and measures up quite nicely. With my experience of East Indiaman and now Viking Slave, I'm a Griff Hosker fan. Whether he proves to be a one-trick pony or is able to move beyond the coming-of-age narrative remains to be seen, but based on a small trial size, Hosker can write his tail off and deliver a superb tale that filters out all the fluff and padding. 200 pages is the perfect size, and that's a real surprise considering bulky marketplace parameters on historical fiction. It's probably one of the reasons why Hosker self-publishes. Viking Slave is a fantastic read and a good place to start if you want to try Hosker's work. You could do East Indiaman or Viking Slave like I did to get your feet wet with this author. So that's it for this episode, and that's it for this year. I managed to get us 8 new episodes of the podcast this year, and we got it back rolling every 2 weeks, so that's a really, really good thing. We also managed to post 130 times on the blog this year. That's a combination of podcast episodes, video posts, and of course, novel and short story reviews. While it feels like I've worked my tail off this year with juggling all of these blog posts, editing, videos, and podcast episodes, this year was actually our lowest productivity in 7 years, believe it or not. So, if you were pleased with 2024's output, then it can only get better from here, right? Cheers to the coming of 2025. Let's hope it's a blessed year with good health and good books. Tom and I both love your support, and we enjoy the comments on our social media and the blog. Our hats are tipped to you. With that being said, you'll still get a few video shorts for the remainder of the year, but the podcast will return on January 6th. Lord willing and the creek don't rise, as my dad would say. Take care and have fun doing whatever it is you're doing.